Hey, my name is Dean. I'm 34 years old, and I work receiving at a distribution warehouse on the south edge of Janesville, Wisconsin. One of those long, low buildings you've driven past 1,000 times on the interstate without ever once wondering what's inside it. What's inside it is everything. Auto parts, mostly, and the racking that holds them. 11 aisles high and a quarter-mile deep, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, most days, is me. My job is to know where things are. That's the simplest way I can put it. A truck backs into the dock. I check the freight against the manifest. I find it a home on the shelves, and I write down where I put it so that 6 months from now, when somebody needs a part that hasn't moved since the day it arrived, I can walk straight to it in the dark. I've done it for 11 years. I'm good at it in a way that doesn't get you written about. I'm the guy who knows where everything is. Nobody much knows where I am. That's not a complaint. It's just the shape of the job. My father did the same job in the same building for 31 years before me. Ray Wexler. He started on the docks when the place still made things instead of just storing them, and he worked his way to floor lead, and he was proud of it in the quiet way men of his kind are proud of work, not bragging, just steady. The company changed hands twice while he was there, and the second time, the new owners ran a study and decided his position was redundant, and they let him go 8 months before his pension would have fully vested. He never said much about it. He took a job at the lumber yard and worked there until his heart gave out at 59, on a Tuesday, lifting bundles of shingles he was too old to be lifting. I was 23. I went to work at the warehouse that had thrown him away within the year, partly because the benefits were good and the work was steady, and partly, if I'm honest, because it felt like the only place I could still find him. Some things sit on a back shelf long enough that the system stops counting them, stops expecting them to move. I never said it out loud, but I'd been on the back shelf a while myself. My days were a straight line. I'd get up before light, drink coffee standing at the counter, drive in, work, drive home to a duplex that was too quiet, eat whatever was fastest, watch a little TV without seeing it, and turn in early. The phone didn't light up much past about 8, and I'd long since stopped expecting it to. I'd had a girl in my 20s named Steph who'd wanted me to be more ambitious, to fight for the lead position, to want things out loud, and I never could. And she got tired of waiting for a man to ask for his own life, and she left. I didn't blame her. I'd watched my father ask for nothing his whole life and get less, and somewhere in there I'd decided that wanting things out loud was for people who hadn't learned yet how it ends. So I kept my head down and counted other people's inventory and told myself I was fine. That was my flaw, though I wouldn't have called it that at the time. I could find anything in that building except a reason to put my own name on the manifest. That brings me to a Thursday in February, 2 winters ago, which is where this whole thing actually starts. It was cold the way Wisconsin gets cold in February, the kind that gets into the seams of the truck and stays there. I'd worked a long shift, and I had exactly $20 to my name until payday Friday, which I knew because I'd checked. The way you check when $20 is the whole number. I stopped at the gas station off the County G exit to put what I could in the tank, and that's where she was. She was at the pump across from mine, and her card had been declining. I could tell from the way she kept feeding it into the reader and pulling it back out, slower each time, like maybe patience would change the answer. She had an old hatchback with out-of-state plates packed to the windows with everything a person owns, when everything a person owns has to fit in a car. The hood of her coat was down, and her hair had come half out of whatever she'd tied it back with that morning, and she had the specific stillness of someone doing math they already know the result of. When she finally gave up on the card and just stood there with both hands flat on the roof of the car, head down, I saw that her shoulders were shaking. and that she was crying in the way people cry when they've been holding it for hours, and the gas pump is just the thing that finally broke it. There was a paper coffee cup on the roof of her car, with the lid chewed up like she'd been worrying it with her teeth. And that detail, I don't know why, is the one I remember most. I'll tell you the truth about what happened next, because the truth is the only part worth telling. I almost didn't do anything. I had $20 and a tank that was a quarter full, and my own narrow week to get through. And it was the anniversary of my father's death that very Thursday, which I hadn't told a soul because there was no soul to tell, and I was tired all the way down. I figured someone else would help her. I figured it wasn't mine to fix. I had my hand on my truck door, getting in, ready to be one more person who drove past a stranger having the worst night of her life. What stopped me was that nobody else was even looking at her. There were 2 other cars at the pumps, and both drivers were staring straight ahead the way you do when you've decided not to see something. And I thought about my father at 59, redundant, written off, lifting shingles, and I thought, you don't write off a person. So I got back out. I didn't make a thing of it. I walked over and I put my 20 in the slot on her side and I said, "It's prepaid now. Put it wherever you need it." She turned around and looked at me with a face that had given up on strangers being kind, red-eyed, exhausted, and she started to say she couldn't. She'd pay me back. Did I have a number? And I told her there was no number and nothing to pay back. That I'd been broke before, and somebody had once done the same for me, which wasn't even true. I just said it so she could take the gas without it costing her any more than it already had. She asked my name. I told her Dean. She didn't tell me hers. She filled her tank. It took the whole 20, almost exactly, and she got in her packed-up car and pulled out onto the county road heading west. And I stood there in the cold watching her taillights until they were gone, and then I drove home and ate leftovers and didn't think I'd ever see her again, because why would I? I went a whole year not thinking about her, more or less. Not because she didn't matter, because that's what a small mercy is. You give it and it's gone, like freight that leaves the dock. You don't track where it ends up. Payday came. Winter turned to spring, turned to a whole rotation of seasons. The only thing of note that happened that year happened in the fall, when word came down that our parent company had sold the warehouse, the whole operation, to a holding firm out of Chicago nobody had heard of, and the floor spent 2 months in the particular kind of dread that working people learn in their bones. We'd all seen this before. New ownership meant a study, and a study meant somebody'd be found redundant, and we all knew which of us were old enough, or expensive enough, or quiet enough to be the line item that got cut. Gus Pelletier, who'd worked the floor for 35 years and had known my father, said it plain in the break room. They didn't buy a warehouse. They bought a building with people in the way of the building. Gus was 63 and had no filter left, and was right more often than was comfortable. The new boss arrived on a Monday in November. We'd been told corporate was sending someone to run the place. A turnaround manager, they called it, which everybody on the floor correctly translated to mean the person who decides who stays. We were all out on the floor pretending to work and watching the front office. And the door opened, and she walked in. It was her. I want to be careful about how I say this, because it's the hinge the whole thing turns on. She didn't look like the woman from the gas station. That woman had been at the bottom of something. This one was at the top of it, a charcoal coat that fit her like it had been measured, her hair pulled back neat instead of falling loose, a leather folder under her arm, walking the length of my warehouse like she was already doing the math on it, which she was. But it was the same face. I'd watched it cry on the roof of a car for the length of time it takes a tank to fill, and you don't forget a face you've seen at the exact second it breaks. It was her. A year and some months later, and the stranger I'd given my last $20 to had walked into my building as the person who held all our jobs in that leather folder. She didn't recognize me. I knew it in the first 3 seconds, when her eyes passed over me on the floor exactly the way they passed over the racking and the forklifts, and Gus and everybody else, assessing, fair, but with no flicker of you. Why would she? I'd been a man at a gas pump in the dark for 90 seconds on the worst night of her life. She'd had 10,000 worse seconds since, and a whole climb back up out of wherever that night had been the bottom of. To her, I was furniture. And I made a decision standing right there by the receiving dock. Fast. The way I almost never decide anything. I wasn't going to say a word, because the kind of thing I'd done at that gas station only counts if you don't ever hand somebody the bill for it. The second you say, "Remember me, I'm the one who saved you," it stops being a kindness and becomes a debt. And I would rather have swallowed my own tongue than turn that night into a debt. So I kept my mouth shut and went back to checking a manifest, and that was the start of the strangest and best year of my life. Her name was Claire Donnelly. She gathered us in the break room that first morning and told us the truth as far as she was allowed to tell it, which I came to learn was more truth than people in her position usually risk. She said the warehouse had been losing money, that the new owners expected a turnaround in 18 months, that there would be changes and some of them would be hard, and that she was not going to lie to us about easy things to make a hard week feel better. She said she'd run her own business once and lost it, and knew exactly what it felt like to be on the other side of a meeting like this one. Then, she did something none of us expected. She took off her coat, asked Gus to walk her through the floor, and spent the rest of that first day not in the office but out among the racking, asking how things actually worked, writing in her folder, listening more than she talked. By the end of the week, she knew more about how that warehouse really ran than the last 2 managers had learned in years, because she'd asked the people who ran it. She was sharp in a way that took the floor a while to forgive. She changed the receiving flow in my area in her second week, and I'll admit I bristled, because I'd had it the way I had it for 11 years. And she came over, and we went at it for 10 minutes over a routing decision. Both of us stubborn, and at the end of it she'd convinced me she was right about half of it, and I'd convinced her she was wrong about the other half. And she said, "Fine. We'll do it your way on the back aisles and my way on the dock, and in a month we'll count and the loser buys coffee." A month later she brought me a coffee without a word and set it on the desk and walked off, which was how I learned she'd run the numbers and I'd won the back aisles. That was the first time I caught myself watching her cross the floor. The old guard didn't trust her at first. A young woman, an outsider, sent by the people who'd bought us. Some of the men were worse than they should have been about it, the way some men get when a woman knows the job better than they do. She handled it the way I'd handle a part that won't seat, patiently, with steady pressure, no drama. She didn't pull rank to win an argument. She'd win it on the merits, or concede it, and people respect that, even when they don't want to. Within 2 months, the floor had stopped saying the new boss and started saying Claire, which around there is the highest credential there is. We worked close, her and me, because receiving is where the whole operation's truth lives. What's actually coming in, what's actually moving, what's been sitting dead since the Clinton administration. She'd come find me with a question maybe 3 times a day. And the questions got longer, and then they weren't all about inventory. She figured out fast that I was the person who knew where everything was, and she started to lean on it, and I started finding reasons to still be on the floor when she was working late, which was most nights, because she worked later than anyone in that building, and never once made you feel it was so you'd work later too. One thing puzzled her about me, and she said it out loud eventually, the way she said most things. She'd noticed that I knew the operation better than the floor lead, better arguably than the last manager, and that I'd never once put in for the lead position in 11 years, and that I'd let 2 men with half my knowledge get promoted over me without a word of complaint. "You're the most capable person in this building, and you act like you're trying not to be seen," she said one evening, leaning on the dock door, genuinely turning it over. "I've fired people for being less useful than you and getting paid more. Why don't you ever ask for anything?" I didn't have a good answer, so I gave her the half answer. I told her my father had asked for nothing his whole life, and the company had still found him redundant, 8 months short of his pension, and worked him into an early grave at the lumber yard after, and that somewhere in there I decided asking out loud was for people who hadn't seen how it ends. She went quiet a second. Then she said, "That's not a reason, that's a scar you've decided to live inside." And she didn't push it further, but I noticed she remembered it. Because 2 weeks later, she quietly corrected my pay grade to where it should have been all along and put a note in the system about it, and never mentioned it to me. And I only found out from my check, which is, I came to understand exactly how Claire Donnelly did the things that mattered. There's an evening I have to tell you about, because it's the one that broke me open, even though nothing happened in it, but talking. It was late, past 9, and we were the only 2 left in the building. There'd been a hard week. Corporate had sent down its first round of targets, and the numbers were ugly, and she'd been carrying them alone. And we'd ended up sitting on the loading dock with the big door rolled up and the cold coming in, and 2 coffees gone lukewarm between us, looking out at the empty lot and the highway lights beyond it. And without any lead-up, in the flat, tired voice people use for the things they don't usually say, she told me how she'd ended up here. She told me she'd built a company once, a small logistics outfit, her whole self poured into it, and that a partner she'd trusted had quietly maneuvered her out of her own business and taken it, legally, in a way she couldn't fight without money she didn't have, and that her marriage had come apart in the same 6 months under the weight of it. She said there'd been a stretch where she had nothing, not a metaphor, nothing, a car and what was in it, driving west away from a city that had stopped being hers, with no plan past the next exit. And then she said, there was a night, somewhere out here, actually, middle of February, freezing, and my card had finally died, and I was at a gas station with no way to put fuel in the car. And I was standing there figuring out whether I was going to sleep in a parking lot in single digits, and a man I never saw before or since came over and put $20 in the pump and told me there was nothing to pay back, and got in his truck and left. $20. That's all it was. She was looking out at the highway, not at me. I've thought about that man more than I've thought about almost anyone. Because I decided that night that the world was just people taking from each other, and he wrecked the whole theory in about 90 seconds and drove off before I could even tell him my name. And somewhere on the road after that, I decided that if a stranger with nothing could do that for me, I didn't get to lie down. I built myself back up out of that $20. The whole climb. I never told anybody that, because it sounds insane that a tank of gas turns a person's life. But it wasn't the gas. It was that somebody counted me when there was no reason to. I want to tell you I told her. I didn't. I sat there with my own $20 in her story, and my father's anniversary that same night she was describing. And I understood that the worst night of her life, and one of the worst of mine, had been the same night, on the same patch of frozen concrete. And I couldn't say a word, because if I said it now, it would turn the one clean thing I'd ever done into a claim, into that was me. You owe me. Look how good I am. So I just sat with it. She'd put her hand on the cold concrete between us at some point, and I put mine down near it, not touching, just there, And after a while, she leaned her head against the doorframe and closed her eyes, and we didn't talk anymore. And the line I'd been careful not to look at for 2 months was lit up plain as a dock light, and I knew exactly where it was, and I knew I was going to cross it, and I knew I couldn't, not while she signed my checks. And I drove home that night more torn up than I'd been since my father died. The thing about a turnaround is that there are 2 versions, and you don't always find out which one you're in until late. It came out in March. Claire had spent 4 months turning the warehouse genuinely around. The numbers were climbing. The floor was tighter than it had been in a decade. People who'd been braced to be cut were starting to relax. And then she flew to Chicago for a quarterly review and came back different. Quiet, tight around the eyes. It took her 3 days to tell me, on that same dock, and when she did, her voice was as flat as the night she'd told me about the gas station, but for a worse reason. The turnaround had never been the point. The holding company hadn't bought a warehouse to fix it. They'd bought the land, 26 acres of it, with highway frontage, worth far more cleared than running, and the plan from the first day had been to stabilize the operation just enough to sell the business as a going concern on paper, then quietly close it, lay off everyone, and flip the real estate to a developer who already had a letter of intent signed. Claire had been the turnaround manager because a profitable operation sells the dirt better than a failing one. She'd been brought in to make the place look alive so they could kill it cleanly. She'd done her job too well, made it too real, gotten too close to the people. And now the man running the holding firm, his name was Holloway, and I'd meet him soon enough, wanted her to execute the closure on a schedule. 81 people, including Gus, including me, the whole floor, by the end of summer. Redundant A-line item in the way of the building. My father's exact death, multiplied by 81, and Claire was being handed the pen. "I can do it and keep my career," she said, looking at the floor she'd spent 4 months saving. "Or I can refuse, and they'll fire me and bring in someone who'll do it anyway. Those are the only 2 real options. I've run them forward every way I can. The place closes either way." She laughed, with no humor in it at all. I clawed my way back up from that $20 so I could be the person who does this to 81 people. That's the climb. That's where it led. Holloway came to the warehouse himself in April, when Claire stalled the schedule 1 time too many. I'd built him up in my head as something dramatic, and he turned out to be worse than dramatic. Ordinary, pleasant, certain, a good suit, and an easy laugh and the absolute unshakable belief that the 81 people on that floor existed as a cost on a page he was authorized to reduce. He walked the floor with Claire trailing him, and he was perfectly polite to the men, called Gus Chief, asked me how long I'd been here, and said 11 years. Wow, that's loyalty in a voice that meant that's a man who should have left a decade ago. And then in the break room, with a dozen of us close enough to hear because he didn't think it mattered who heard, he told Claire to stop dragging her feet, that sentiment wasn't a line item, that she of all people knew there was no such thing as a building worth keeping when the dirt under it was worth 4 times more, and that he'd hired her precisely because she understood that a workforce is just an expense you haven't optimized yet. I'd never in my life raised my voice, and I didn't raise it then. That's not where whatever I have lives. But I put down the manifest in my hand, and I stood up off the stool at the receiving desk, and the room noticed, because I was the man who never stood up about anything, and I walked over, and I stood next to Claire, and I said, plainly, to Holloway, "She already told you the answer. You're just not used to hearing it from somebody who means it." He looked at me like a part that had spoken out of turn. He started to say something about this not concerning me, about me being exactly the kind of overhead he was talking about, and that was the moment Claire stepped forward, not behind me, beside me, the way the brave ones always do in the end, and she stopped him with one sentence. "I'm not going to close it, Tom." The room went still. "You'll close it the moment I fire you," Holloway said, recovering smooth. "You can fire me in the next 60 seconds, Claire said, level, certain, the voice of a woman who has done this math forward every possible way and arrived somewhere past fear. "But before you do, you should know what I spent 4 months building while you thought I was decorating a corpse. This warehouse is profitable now. Genuinely, not on paper. Actually, I've got 11 months of clean numbers and a customer base that's grown 20%, and I have spent the last 3 weeks on my own time putting together a group of those customers and 2 regional banks who are prepared to buy this operation away from your holding company at fair market value for the business, not the dirt. The business, which your own quarterly filings now make it very awkward for you to refuse, because you've spent 4 months telling your investors this place was being turned around for sale, and here is a buyer, at the price you yourselves established, ready to close. You can sell me the warehouse, Tom, or you can kill a profitable business you publicly promised to save in front of 81 witnesses and a paper trail, and explain that to the people you answer to. Those are your 2 real options. I've run them forward every way I can. I have replayed Holloway's face 100 times. He was a man who had walked into a room certain he held all the inventory. And he stood there while a woman he'd hired to be his instrument laid out, in flat numbers. Exactly how his own logic had been turned into a noose, in public, with a whole floor watching him understand it. He didn't have a single thing to own. He said something about lawyers and he left, and the dust of him settled, and Gus Pelletier, 63 years old, who'd buried his pride at that company a long time ago, started to clap, slow. And then the whole break room was clapping, and Claire stood there in the middle of it, not smiling, just breathing, like someone who'd finally set down a weight she'd been carrying since a frozen gas station the year before. They did fire her, technically. A week later, the holding company couldn't afford the optics of selling under public pressure, so they cut her loose for cause and then quietly sold the operation to her buyers within the month, because she'd built the trap too well to climb out of. She'd sacrificed the career to save the place, and she'd known she would, and she'd done it anyway. The warehouse survived. All 81 of us survived. My father's death didn't get to happen 81 more times. The evening after she cleaned out the office for the last time as our boss, no longer my boss, no longer anyone's, just a person who'd burned down her own job to keep mine, we ended up on the dock again, door rolled up, 2 coffees, the lot empty. And I knew that if I was ever going to say the thing I'd spent 34 years not saying, it was now, when she wasn't above me on any chart anywhere, when she was as broke in prospects as the night I'd first seen her, and twice as brave. So I went first, through the fault, before the feeling. Because the fault was the thing holding it all tight. "I have to tell you 2 things, and I'm going to do both of them badly," I said. "The first one is about me. You asked me once why I never asked for anything, and I gave you the answer about my dad, and it was true, but it wasn't the whole of it. The whole of it is I'm a coward in one exact spot. I let the only person I ever cared about walk away once rather than say a word out loud. Because I decided wanting things out loud was for people who hadn't been taught yet how it ends. And I was about to do it again. I was going to sit here and watch you drive off into whatever you do next and never say a thing, same as the last time, and call it dignity. I made myself keep going. I don't want you to drive off, Claire. I've known that since the dock in February. I just couldn't say it while you signed my check, and now you don't, so I'm saying it badly, out loud, on purpose, for the first time in my whole life." She didn't say anything for a second. Then, quietly, she said, "What's the second thing?" So I told her the second thing. I told her about the County G exit, the chewed-up coffee cup on the roof of her car, the $20, the anniversary of my father that same night, that I'd never told a soul about. I told her I'd recognized her the second she walked through that door in November, and had decided never to say it. Because the only clean thing I'd ever done in my life stopped being clean the moment it became a thing I could hold over her, and I'd rather have carried it to my grave than turn her worst night into a debt she owed me. She was very still while I said it, and then I watched her put the year together, the dock, the gas station story she'd told me not knowing, every time I'd gone quiet. And her eyes filled, and she let them, the same way she'd let them on the roof of that car, and she said, in a voice that wasn't level anymore, "You really thought I wouldn't figure it out eventually, Dean?" She wiped her face with the back of her hand. I've been telling that story for 2 years to a man I was falling in love with, and it never once occurred to me to look at his face while I told it. God, you let me tell you about you. Twice, she laughed, wet and disbelieving. You absolute fool of a good man. You're the most findable person in this whole building. You know where every single thing in 26 acres lives. And you spent 2 years making sure I couldn't find the one thing that mattered, which is that it was you the whole time. She put her hand over mine on the cold concrete, all the way this time, no daylight between them. I didn't claw my way back up out of $20. I clawed my way back up out of you. I just didn't know your face yet. Then she kissed me, on the dock, with the cold coming in through the open door. And it wasn't the careful professional distance of the year we'd spent pretending. It was the whole climb and the whole quiet, and the 2 worst nights of our lives turning out to have been the same night. And it held. The way the things you've waited too long for hold hardest once you finally stop waiting. A year after that, the warehouse looks like a place people fight to work at instead of brace to be cut from. Claire owns it now, her and the 2 banks and a handful of the customers, but it's hers to run, and she runs it like a person who knows exactly what it costs to lose everything and won't let it happen to anybody on her floor. We're profitable for real, the way she always said. We added a second shift instead of cutting the first. Gus Pelletier finally retired this spring, on his own terms, with a party in the break room and a pension that's whole. And he cried and pretended it was the cold, and Claire pretended to believe him. And me, I finally asked. That's the part of my own story I'm proudest of, because it's the part I had to build myself. I put in for the operations lead out loud, on paper, with my name on the manifest for once, and I got it, and not because I'm sleeping with the owner, which Claire made very clear by making me interview for it like everyone else, and grilling me harder than anyone. I run the floor my father used to run, in the building that threw him away, except it doesn't throw people away anymore, and I think about him every single time I walk it. There's a thing I see most evenings now that I want to leave you with, because it's the truest thing I own, and it isn't dramatic at all. After the second shift clears out, Claire and I lock up together, and we roll up the big dock door same as always, and we sit on the edge of it with 2 coffees and look out at the lot and the highway lights. The exact place where I almost didn't get out of my truck. And she keeps a $20 bill folded in her wallet that she will not spend, that she says is the only money she's ever earned interest on. And some nights she takes it out and holds it and doesn't say anything, and I don't either, because we're past the part where the important things have to be said out loud. We learn to say them, both of us, just barely in time. Now we get to live inside them. I'd spent most of my life believing the world ran on a ledger, that everything you gave got counted somewhere, and the count never came out in your favor, so the smart thing was to keep your head down want nothing out loud, and try not to be the line item that gets cut. My father lived that way, and it killed him, and I was halfway to the same grave when I stood at a gas pump on the anniversary of his death with the last $20 I had in the world. Here's the only thing I know for certain now, and I learned it backwards from a stranger I gave it to before I understood it myself. The things that come back to you are never the things you put on the ledger. They're the ones you give away and forget. The ones you'd swear left the dock for good. I gave a stranger $20 on the worst night of my life and never wrote it down anywhere. And a year later it walked back through my door wearing a charcoal coat and saved every job in the building. And then it stayed. Some inventory you can't track. Turns out, those are the only items that were ever worth a thing.